no sophistication about financial products. And so it's easy for a banker to walk in and say, oh, well, you'll need some of these credit default swaps to protect you in case of this or that. Or those people in Europe who bought these things thinking they were doing a good thing for their city, and in fact it wiped out their whole, wiped out the pensions of it. You know what I'm talking about?
I don't disagree with that at all. I think that derivatives are sophisticated instruments, and as a result, they should, on the whole, only be used by sophisticated entities.
Mm-hmm. So what do you recommend? Do you think there is regulation that would make this all fair and helpful and useful?
Is there regulation that should...
Could it be regulated, and would that fix the problem?
Well, I think regulation is such a complex space to jump into with respect to derivatives. There should be, to my mind, for any entity and any individual who going to transact any financial instrument, forget just derivative, but anyone that's even going to borrow money in the debt market or buy treasuries or on behalf of someone else, there should always be some minimum amount of education that they need to have. So in terms of some sort of regulation, I would love to see much higher standards in terms of education. And I'm by no means am I trying to sell our own product. I mean, we as an institution, we're quite small. We can't go out and educate everyone that works in the financial markets. But we certainly do believe that there is not sufficient educational requirements for people in the financial markets. Mm-hmm. We also believe that in the current education... I wonder,
is there the disclosure that's necessary anyway? I mean, do these people know, how do they know whether the counterparty has the money to pay up? And isn't it possible for the counterparties to change so that whoever you originally are dealing with, later you might be dealing with somebody else who doesn't have the money? Because that's my understanding, that you can sell these derivatives, but I don't know if that's true.
Well, you can't. So that's a good question. You can't. A derivative, as I originally said, it's a bilateral contract. It's between two entities. So okay. I sign one contract, you sign the other one. And you can't just go and that contract to someone else without my approval, because I've signed it.
I think there are derivatives that you can trade.
There aren't derivatives that you can trade that way, because if you and I are the two signatures a contract, you can't tear it up and then ask me to sign a new one just because you've decided that you want to pass it to someone else. What generally happens is it's called a novation. You can novate it to someone else, but I have to approve the counterparty.
I guess maybe what I'm thinking of is that, so the bank is the counterparty, but the bank is selling the other side of the risk to hedge funds, right?
Yes, but they're not selling your contract, writing an entirely
well, the bank
contract.
may still be on the hook for it, like AIG. AIG's on the hook for it, but who was supposed to pick up the default if it went bad? That would be hedge funds or investors, and those investors might not have the money, right? They sell the high risk things to one set of investors, and then they're selling protection.
That's right. Securitization, a simple way to describe it is that you take all the risk and you say riskiest stuff is at the bottom, and we call that the equity bit of the securitization, and then the least risky stuff is at the top, and we call that the senior piece, and everything in the middle is called mezzanine.
It's called what?
Mezzanine.
I feel like I'm at Nordstrom's or actually Neiman Marcus.
The problem with financial products and derivatives in general is the terminology. We get so steeped in this terminology that it's really hard for us to have to cleanly describe what these products are and how they work without using all this terminology. And frankly, the terminology is there to make it clearer about what we're talking about, but it does make it really hard for people to sort of wade through and better understand it, because it's like learning a new language. I'm so sorry.
I have a question about the credit rating agencies, because when an institution loses its credit rating, who is determining that? Is that Moody's or Standard & Poor's, or why is it that they're the ones deciding whether they're losing their credit or not? How do they know when an institution's credit rating is going down?
Well, the rating agencies were ultimately set up to be third-party providers of a credit analysis of borrower. So it was all about helping the debt market become a bit more liquid and a bit more transparent. So in the past, most entities, most corporates, borrowed in the form of loans from banks. Did that because banks had their own internal credit analysis that they did to determine how risky different borrowers were and how much money they were going to lend them and at what price. But the corporate demand for borrowings eventually, ultimately, far outstripped to some extent the supply of cash that the banks could provide in the form of loans. And loans also weren't very liquid, and they were very tailored. And the bond market became a much more interesting space for corporates to borrow. So you didn't necessarily have to go to a bank to borrow money. You could issue a bond and sell it to a bunch of different institutional investors. The problem with that was that these institutional investors, they weren't necessarily like banks. They didn't have huge credit departments set up simply to provide credit ratings internally for all of these different corporates. So they needed, to some extent, a third party provide a credit rating for these different borrowers so that we could better analyze and compare and contrast different investment options. Do I invest in this AA, or do I invest in this AA, or in this single A, or in this triple B, et cetera, et cetera? And that's ultimately the function of the credit rating agencies, is to provide some gauge of creditworthiness for different bonds that are out there for different borrowers. Ultimately, corporates and financial and sovereign borrowers. So the credit rating agency is when they say that an entity is being downgraded, when they say an entity is being upgraded, when they say they're going to withdraw a rating. It's their own internal decisions, and it's based upon public information they have, the public financial information they have about that particular entity. And they have analysts who follow specific entities. There's an analyst who follows automobiles, and there's an analyst who follows financials, and there'll be an analyst who follows chemical companies, et cetera, et cetera. And the interesting thing about them is that, on the whole, most large institutional investors don't really rely upon the public ratings for their investment decisions. They make their own credit. They do their own credit analysis. Banks, in particular, certainly don't lend money in the form of loans based on public ratings. They have their own internal credit analysis that they do.
We do take a lot of whether an organization or a bank or any institution has a AAA rating, they are perceived as being of a certain higher order of agency or organization in terms of their fiscal health. And so...
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And to be fair, on the whole, it's rare. The analysis that the rating agency does is not significantly different from the analysis that the bank does or the institutional investor does. They're all very similar types of analysis and generally lead to the same conclusion. It's rare that one rating agency says this is a AAA entity and there's an institutional investor there who says, no, this entity is on their way to going bust. That's a pretty rare scenario. It's on the